Okay, being it's 10:30 and there's a lot of material here, we'll start. Anybody who wants will join in. Today's shiur, on the one hand, we'll keep to the theme of Tefilah that we've been learning in previous shiurim, but we'll deviate from the topics that we regularly have been dealing with and touch on aspects of Tefilah that pertain to Purim, so that the shiur has an element also of minyanei diyoma. And excuse me, I chose to touch on 2 points that are relevant to the world of Tefilah and Purim. Maybe I should introduce and say that in truth, when you look at the Tefilah of Purim, it's not so different than every day's Tefilah. The primary notable differences are that we add in Kriyat HaMegillah and Kriyat HaTorah, even though it's not the order of Kriyat HaTorah, and we'll speak about that in a moment, and that we do not recite Tachanun, which is something that is very common on any special or unique day. Therefore, there isn't much outstanding, and yet there is what to discuss. Was it? Correct. Al-Anisim. Forgot that. Right. Yeah, we add in Al-Anisim. So, okay, yeah. The first topic that we'll touch on is the aspect of Kriyat HaTorah. As I said, even on years that Purim falls on a Monday or Thursday, we deviate from the regular Kriyah that is connected to Parashat HaShavua, and we read a special Kriyah for Purim. That Kriyah is mentioned in the Mishnah in the end of Masechet Megillah. The Mishnah begins, and that's the first source on the pages, Matnitin, the Pesach Korim. Mishnah begins by going through the different Kriyot, starting with Pesach, and then we get the Purim, Bepurim Vayavo Amalek. I don't think that it's overly surprising to most people. You're familiar with the Kriya of Purim, that it is from the end of Parshat Beshalach, the story of Amalek coming and attacking the Jewish people, and the war that takes place afterwards. Fine. That seems reasonable. However, when we take a look a little more carefully at this Kriya, and we assess it in reference to some of the requirements in halacha as to what is an appropriate Kriya in the Torah, here we find somewhat of a problem. The Gemara earlier in Megillah states, Hadetani Rav Shimi ein pochatim me'asara psukim bebeit hakneset vaydaber ole min haminyan hanei asara keneged mi. So the discussion there in the Gemara is to understand a particular requirement. The requirement that is mentioned here is that the length, the minimal length of a Kriyah in Kriyat HaTorah should be 10 psukim. And I didn't bring it here, but there are discussions as to how it should be divided. In other words, if you had only 10 psukim, who would read the 4? 3, 3, and 4. But who would be the one to read the 4? The Gemara says it's appropriate for the first one. For the second one, finds a reason any one of them could read it. In any case, here the Gemara asks, where is that basis for 10 psukim? And it suggests several options. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi keneged 10 batlanim shebeit hakneset, to represent the 10 batlanim, those who refrain from doing work and sit and learn. And this is a group of people who are significant in the halacha, because for a town to be considered a town halachically, it has to have these 10 people who sit and learn and give it some kind of stature. And therefore, the reading reflects that idea, the 10 psukim. Rabbi Yosef Amar keneged 10 hadibrot. Yosef connects it to the 10 hadibrot shene'emru leMoshe b'Sinai. Rabbi Levi Amar keneged 10 hilulim she'amar David b'Sefer Tehillim. 10 halukot that can be found in the Tehillim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar keneged 10 ma'amarot shebahem nivra ha'olam. Again, it stands parallel to the 10 ma'amarot Vayomer Hashem that are found in the description of the Bria in Perek Aleph in Bereshit. Gemara then questions because the numbers don't quite work out, and it explains how that will work out. What is important to us is the fact that it's taken as a given that a section of Kriyat HaTorah has to have 10 psukim. Anybody who was a little more particular and looked, I purposely put in the makor of the Vayavo Amalek, and looked there and saw that it's Shmot Yud Zayin Psukim Chet through Tet Zayin. Quick mathematics, doesn't come up to 10 psukim. Okay? And that's the problem we discuss here. I'm skipping for the moment the Masechet Sofrim and moving on to the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi also notes the issue of the 10 psukim. Rav Huna Amar, some of the Rishonim have the Girsa Rav Huna. It's very, very reasonable that the Chet and Hey were interchangeable. Rav Huna Amar, Shlosha Kriyot Shebatorah. Kriyot mean the 3 people who read, the Olim La Torah, those who read. Lo yifchetu ma'asara psukim. Amongst them, there should be no less than 10 psukim. Chizkiya Amar kineged 10 hadibrot. In other words, again, a discussion of what is the source of it. Furthermore, the Gemara there starts discussing, it begins with another case where there's a problem. A case where the Ma'amadot used to have a special Ma'amadot, were those who represented Am Yisrael for the bringing forth of the public sacrifices. They also fasted and read in the Torah during the week of the Ma'amad, and they had certain sections of reading. And the Gemara says, when you look at some of the psukim, the sections that are read, it's less than 10 psukim. The answers there are either they split certain psukim because they can be split, or they repeat psukim, etc. In that discussion, the Gemara gets to Heitiv Rav Palipa bar Parita Kumei Rabbi Zeura. Rav Palipa, the son of Parita, questioned before Rabbi Zeura, V'harei Parashat Amalek. What about Parashat Amalek? Parashat Amalek does not contain 10 psukim. And there you can't necessarily play games that you would play in some of the other places. Amarlei Shniyai Shehu Siduro Shel Yom. Answers him Rav Zeurei, it may be the same person. He answers, here there's no problem. When we have a broad possibility, as you know, even the Shabbat Kriot, when we read in the Torah, it's not something that's predetermined. It's something that in some point Chazal divided up the Torah to certain parts. To the extent that many of you may know that in Eretz Yisrael, the Torah was completed only once in 3 years, while in Bavel it was completed once a year, like we do. In other words, there were different portions that were read on Shabbat, because there's nothing predetermined. In that case, or when we read part of the Parsha on a Monday and Thursday, then the requirement is that there be no less than 10 psukim because of whatever symbolism it might be. However, in the case of Vayavo Amalek is chosen because it represents the idea of the day, the battle with Amalek. If that's the case, or more accurately, the intent of Amalek to hurt and destroy Am Yisrael and the battle with them, which parallels the story of the Megillah. In that case, then we don't need 10 psukim. We do need 9 psukim, because we need 3 psukim to constitute a proper aliyah. So since we have 3 kruim, 3 people who are reading, we would need 9 psukim, but that we do have in Vayavo Amalek. We don't need 10 when that's a topic in of itself. That's what the Yerushalmi says. However, there seems to have been a wariness in many communities, and there were suggested alternate resolutions how to get to those 10 psukim. The Baal HaMaor, Rabbi Zachia Halevi, in his comments on the Rif, writes as follows: Matnitin bePurim vayavo Amalek, Garsinan beta'anit Yerushalmi, Rav Huna Amar umikan Shuva, Rav Huna Amar, etc. In other words, he brings the Yerushalmi that we just learned, and then he states, umikan Shuva laomrim shechazarat pasuk ha'acharon betzibur lahashlim 10 psukim. This is a response, this is an answer, namely a rejection of the idea that some communities proposed to read a second time, like we do in certain haftarot and so on, to reread a particular pasuk. Here too, there was those who suggested read the last pasuk, and that way you get to 10 psukim. Says the Baal HaMaor, from this Yerushalmi, you see that it's unnecessary, and therefore, since it's unnecessary, it would be inappropriate to do. Then he says, "V'yesh makdimim v'korim min v'yomer Hashem el Moshe avo lifnei ha'am." There are those who begin reading before Vayavo Amalek, just to have the necessary psukim. V'hakol ta'ut biyadam. All these suggestions are simply a mistake, because as we saw in the Yerushalmi, there is no need in this particular case for 10 psukim. The truth is, and it's interesting that he does not quote it, I don't know, may have not been before him, he may have not been aware of it, but basically what the Baal HaMaor says is found in a much earlier source, in the Masechet Sofrim, which we skipped before. Masechet Sofrim, we find as follows: Korin Vayavo Amalek. We read on Purim in the section of Vayavo Amalek. Va'af al pi she'ein ba ela tish'a psukim. And even though there are only 9 psukim, and we already know that you need 10 psukim, ein matchilim bevayishma yitro ela rishon kore 3 psukim vayavo Amalek. So he presents here an alternate suggestion that was obviously raised earlier on, to continue the reading and begin the next parsha. The next parsha after Bashalach is Yitro vayavo, Yitro choten Moshe. He says, we don't do that. El harishon koreh shlosha psukim, which are vayavo Amalek, vayomer Moshe, vayas Yoshua. Vesheni koreh, the second one reads, vayak asher yarim Moshe, videi Moshe, vayachalosh Yoshua, 3 psukim. Shlishi koreh, vayomer Hashem, vayiven Moshe, vayomer ki yad al kesya milchama Hashem. Umenichim sefer Torah bimkomo. Don't play around with it. Don't add. We don't need to. This is sufficient. So what we see is that though we find a halacha in Kriyat Torah that a Kriya should constitute at least 10 psukim, Purim's Kriya is an exception. And to the best of my knowledge, it's the only such exception. In other words, what I said about the Ma'amadot, there we do find solutions. Part of the problem is it's only 8 psukim there, it's not even 9. But in other Kriyot, we have at least 10 psukim. This is the one exception. The exception that we only read 9 psukim, fulfilling the basic requirement of 3 psukim for each Oleh. And since, as the Yerushalmi says, it covers an entire issue, a topic that is relevant and pertinent to the Kriya of Purim, we do not need to add any more. The Tosfot there, after quoting the Yerushalmi, brings a further establishment to that, at least in Minhag. And he says, Im pochatim asara, v'im tomar, yesh lomar, desidra diyomahu, as he quotes the Yerushalmi, and then he says, Dahachi nami, this is the middle line there, Dahachi nami, amrinan lekaman, so too we say, this piece is found earlier in Masechet Megillah, so he says lekaman, further on, in Daf Chaf Gimel, De'ein maftirim pachot me-24 psukim. Haftorah also has requirements. Haftorah should be at least 21 psukim. Okay? The idea is, basis of Shabbat, Shiva Kruim, we have 7 aliyot, so we have 3 psukim against each koreh of the Torah. So we need 21 psukim. Veheicha desalik inyana korin shapir lepachot. But there it also says, if the topic, the issue is completed in less than 21 psukim, then we do not need to add. In other words, where there is an open-ended kind of thing, then there are criteria, there's things that they represent, the 10 psukim of Kriyat Torah represent something, the 21 psukim of the Haftorah represent something, and therefore we read that. However, when we want to read or remind or raise a particular topic, and that topic is completed in less than those psukim, as long as it fulfills other requirements, then we suffice with less, and therefore, if you look at the Kriya of Purim, you'll see that it's shorter than any other Kriya that we read, because Salik Inyana, the issue has been completed. So that's one little point that is worth knowing and having some kind of background in reference to the Tefilah on Purim. The second issue is the more central issue, and whatever time allows, we will deal with it. When we mentioned before different things that change or vary in the regular Tefilah on Purim, I think it was quite clear that there was something that may have been expected and was not mentioned. What would that be? What would you expect there to be in Purim that we don't have? Hallel. Okay? And that is a discussion that already comes up in the Gemara in Megillah and Daf Yud Daled. Now, I'm going to go through this Gemara with a focus on the issues that we are going to touch on in the Shiur. There are many different things to discuss on this Gemara, and it's not a simple Gemara. There's some issues of terminology and so on that I'm not going to touch upon. Okay? So if there are questions that come to your mind, you're welcome to come after the Shiur, but let's not disturb the Shiur with relevant and true questions that might appear in reference to this Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, 48 נביאים ו7 נביאות נתנבאו להם לישראל. There were 48 Nevi'im and 7 Nevi'ot that were מתנבא, gave nevuah to Am Yisrael, ולא פיחתו ולא הותירו על מה שכתוב בתורה חוץ ממקרא מגילה. And they didn't add or subtract from the mitzvot as they are found in the Torah, with one exception, Mikra Megillah. And we find that the establishment, the institution of the Mikra Megillah is done by Sanhedrin, that at that time amongst them were Nevi'im, as it was the end of the period of Nevuah. Even if we delay the period of Achashverosh into the mid-Persian period, there are still Nevi'im around. Okay? Without getting into the question of when exactly did the Megillah take place. My Darush. How did they come to this conclusion? And now the words My Darush immediately tell us that they're not coming on the basis of a Nevuah, because a Navi can't come and establish a halacha on the basis of Nevuah. That was left for Moshe Rabbi. He can give a tzav sha'ah. He can give a momentary demand or requirement to do something. But to establish an ongoing halacha, that a Navi can't do on the basis of Nevuah. As they acted here as Chachamim. Chachamim use rationale, halachic logic. My darush, what were they dorish? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Kocha. Uma me'avdut lecherut amrinan shira, mimita lechayim lo kol sheken. If we find that we say shira, or there is shira said in a redemption from slavery to freedom, namely Yetziat Mitzrayim, then when the redemption is an all much greater redemption because it redeemed us from death, we were faced death, lo kol sheken, is it not all the more so that we should say shira? Now here's something interesting, okay? Without getting into what's the shira that is referred to, one of the problems in the sugya here, but the Gemara seems to make an equation between Megillah and shira. In other words, something that will be of importance as we go on, Kriyat Megillah is not just a function of nizkarim, in the sense of remembering what happened and therefore nasim, but Kriyat Megillah has another function, a function of shevach, shira, praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, it's not all that surprising when you take into account the broad halachot of Kriyat Megillah. One of the interesting things in Kriyat Megillah is that Megillah receives priority over other mitzvot, at least as far as the order of fulfillment. Because in reference to mitzvot d'oraita, it's brought that Megillah comes before mitzvot d'oraita, but the poskim note that that's a question of if both can be done, and the question is which is done first. But there's still an issue of a certain priority given to Megillah. And why? What's the explanation for that? Pirsume Nisa, the publication of the miracle. And it's not just that we learn it. It's also a public publication of the miracle, telling, look what God did to us. that, by definition, is a form of praise, a form of shira. But in any event, what we see here clearly, that Chazal understood that when the Megillah was instituted to be read, it was meant to be read also as a form of praise of shira. That's the Gemara there. Ihachi halel nami nema. Now we get to our problem. If that's the case, there's what to celebrate on a miracle that occurred, then we should also say Hallel. And we all know we don't say Hallel on Purim. Hallel nami nema. Lefi she'ein omrim Hallel unless shebechutz la'aretz. So the answer is that we don't say a Hallel on a miracle that occurred in Chutz La'aretz. In Chutz La'aretz we say the Hallel on a miracle that occurred in Eretz Yisrael. But we don't say Hallel when the miracle actually occurred in Chutz La'aretz. Make sense? Yeah? we just spoke about the comparison, right? To what? The Pesach. Says the Gemara. Says the Gemara, that's the case, then how do we say on the Nes of Yetziat Mitzrayim? And again, notice, Shira uses again that same term Shira, and that's part of the complications that exist here. The answer is Kedetanya. עד שלא נכנסו ישראל לארץ, הוכשרו כל ארצות לומר שירה. מי שנכנסו ישראל לארץ, לא הוכשרו כל ארצות לומר שירה. The answer is, now, until Am Yisrael enters Eretz Yisrael, then a grand miracle that occurs anywhere deserves Shira, deserves Hallel. However, once Am Yisrael enters Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael receives that centrality, and therefore miracles that occur outside of Eretz Yisrael do not receive Hallel. Those that occur in Eretz Yisrael do receive Hallel. This kind of change is not something that is unique here. For example, if we talk about the idea of bamot, of public sacrifices, or bringing sacrifices in general, outside of the Mikdash, outside the Bet HaMikdash, right? Until Shlomo builds the first Mikdash, it's permissible. But once he builds the Mikdash, it becomes prohibited. In other words, sometimes a centrality of something shifts the halacha and focuses it just to there, negating other options that may have existed beforehand. And that's what the Gemara says here. Then the Gemara continues and tells us, Rav Nachman Amar, Kriyata zo haleila. Rav Nachman comes and says, and it connects to what we saw beforehand, the Kriya of the Megillah is the statement of Hallel, and therefore we don't need a separate Hallel. The Kriya of the Megillah fulfills the issue of Hallel. Rava offers a different answer. Bishlema hatam Hallelu avdei Hashem ולא עבדי פרעה, אלא הכה, הללו עבדי השם ולא עבדי אחשוורוש, akate avdei Achashverosh anan. Says like this. There we can really say Hallel, because in Hallel we say Hallelu avdei Hashem, which means those who are the servants of God and not others. Yetziat Mitzrayim, that's exactly what happens. Until now, they were subservient to Paro. They were slaves. They come out of Mitzrayim, and from here on, they're subservient to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not to any human. They're no longer Avdei Paro. However, in the miracle in the Megillah, that's not what occurs. In the miracle of the Megillah, it's true that there is this great miracle of saving their lives. Mavet lechayim. But when the cloud clears, the smoke dissipates. After all, look at Perek Yud in the Megillah. Achashverosh is king. He's the master. He puts taxes on, whatever it might be. They are still subservient to Achashverosh. And therefore, it's not relevant, Hallelu Avdei Hashem, because they're also Avdei Achashverosh. And therefore, says Rava, the reciting of Hallel in reference to that miracle was something that Chazal felt was not relevant to institute. Now, you might wonder why Rav Nachman and Rava have to suggest alternate explanations when the Gemara had already explained it because of Neish B'chutz La'aretz and Neish B'Eretz Yisrael. So why are we doing the other things? So that we can understand from the continuation. Where it says, Bein l'Rava, Bein l'Rav Nachman Kashya. It's difficult. Why are they saying this? Whether it applies to Rav Nachman or Rava, the reason that was given already was Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. B'hatanya, Mishenichnesu l'Eretz Yisrael, uchsheru kol haratzot lomar shira. Have we not learned this? And that's a good enough reason not to say or not to institute Hallel. The answer is Kevan shegalu chazru le'echshiran harishon. When they were gole, when they were kicked out of Eretz Yisrael with the destruction of Bayit Rishon, then chazru le'echshiran harishon, in other words, the halacha returned to its original status, that Hallel can be said also on miracles that occur in Chutz La'aretz and not just Eretz Yisrael. Okay. What happens, I'm not touching at the moment, what happens afterwards, they return to Eretz Yisrael, Bizman Hazeh, not the issue I'm touching on now. There is discussion here in the poskim on that point. In any event, therefore, since they could say Hallel on a miracle that occurred in Chutz La'aretz, come Rav Nachman and Rava and suggest alternate reasons why it was not instituted. Whether because it didn't need to be instituted, the Megillah fulfills the requirement, or because it's not relevant, because Avdei Achashverosh Ana. The two reasons presented by Rav Nachman and Rava may not just be separate reasons, but may actually create a halachic conflict. The typical question when two things are given, l'may nafkamina. What difference does it make if it's because of A or because of B? In reference to that, we find an interesting discussion in the Meiri. But before we go to the Meiri, I just want to note, if you look at the Rambam, when he brings the halacha of not reciting Hallel on Purim, Rambam Megillah, you have it before you, Velo tiknu Hallel bePurim, shekriat haMegillah hi Hallel. The Rambam uses the reasoning given by Rav Nachman that reading the Megillah fulfills the requirement of Hallel. However, if you were to compare it, I'm skipping down a bit And you see the Shulchan Aruch brings Ein Korim Halel, but gives no explanation. The Magen Avraham comes and says, Ein Korim Bo Halel, Hacha Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. Why? Because at the time we were still Avdei Achashverosh. So you see that amongst the poskim, it was not definitive which opinion to accept lahalacha. But that only sort of stresses the question, L'may nafka mina, what difference does it make that the poskim bring this reason, that reason? So here we go to the Meiri. The Meiri, there in the Gemara in Daf Yud Daled, brings as follows. דבר ידוע הוא שאין אומרים הלל בפורים, אבל טעם מניעתו נחלקו עליו בגמרא. It's a known thing that we do not say Hallel on Purim. However, the reason for it, that we find differing opinions in the Gemara. והוא שאחד מהם אמר שקריאתה זו היא הלולה. One, the opinion of Rav Nachman, is that reading the Megillah is the fulfillment of the Hallel. ונראה לי, and then he adds, ונראה לי, לטעם זה, שאם היה במקום שאין לו מגילה, שקורא את ההלל, שהרי לא נמנעה קריאתו, אלא מפני שקריאת המגילה במקומו. Says the Meiri, according to Rav Nachman, Kriyata zo halela. What about if there is no Kriyata? If a person is living or finds himself in a situation that he does not have a Megillah to read from, or he can't read Hebrew, right? Because he doesn't have to read the trup, he just has to read the words if he knows how to read Hebrew. Yes, or he has a Megillah, he doesn't know how to read Hebrew. He can't read the Megillah. So now, not only is he missing out the mitzvah the Rabbanan of Kriyat Megillah, but he's also not fulfilling the Hallel for Purim. Says the Meiri, therefore, according to this opinion, in a situation of that sort, then the person should recite Hallel. According to Rav Nachman, the person finds himself without a Megillah, then he should recite Hallel. Seemingly with a bracha. Umikol makom. Tam acher, let's put it this way. At least the poskim, time allows, we'll see, the poskim understood the Meiri in that way. Umikol makom, tam acher ne'emar ba b'Gemara. However, there is another reason given in the Gemara. V'hu mipnei she'adayin avdei Achashverosh hayu. That at the time, they were still subservient to Achashverosh. They hadn't gone out from subservience to freedom. ולטעם זה, אף מי שאין בידו מגילה, אינו קורא את ההלל. And according to Rava's explanation, it doesn't make a difference if he has a Megillah or not. Because even if he doesn't read the Megillah, Hallel was not relevant to Purim. Hallel was not relevant to Purim because they still found themselves in a state of subservience. And therefore, even if he doesn't have a Megillah, he would not say Hallel today. So the Meiri suggests that there is a halachic consequence to which of these two explanations for not reciting Hallel we accept. The halachic consequence is, if a person finds himself without a Megillah, without Kriyat Megillah, does he have to recite Hallel or not? According to the Rav Nachman, the answer would be yes, says the Meiri. according to Rava, says the Meiri, he would not have to. Okay, an interesting discussion, an interesting nafkamina, until the Chida comes into the picture. The Chida starts questioning what the Meiri raised. Okay. The Chida in his book Birkei Yosef, there's a short synopsis here about the Chida that I wrote. The Chida writes as follows: אין קוראים בו את ההלל. הרב המאירי בפסקיו ריש דף ט"ו כתב: דלטעם קריאתה זו הלילה, אם אין לו מגילה יאמר הלל, ולטעם הכת עבדי אחשוורוש, אף שאין לו מגילה לא יאמר הלל. So he brings the Meiri and the consequence the Meiri raised, and he also quotes, which I did not stress, which I should have in the end of the Meiri, he says, Verishon nir'a yoter. The Meiri tends to accept, like the Rambam, the first explanation of Rav Nachman, Kriyata zo halela, and therefore, basically, according to his whole discussion, if a person does not have a Megillah, he should recite Hallel. Ad kan dvarav. Says the Chida, ומשתמות דברי הפוסקים משמע דאין בו הלל לעולם. Says, but when I look at the broad picture of the poskim, it appears that there would not be Hallel recited on Purim, even if a person does not have a Megillah. Basically, what the Chida is saying here is that the Meiri is a dat yachid. The Meiri holds his thing like to hold like Rav Nachman, but most of the poskim do not hold that way. Most of the poskim hold like we saw that the Magen Avram brings the explanation of Rava akate avdei Achashverosh anan, because they were still subservient to Achashverosh. And he explains, V'tama, the Rava hu de'amar akate avdei. Since Rava is the one who said the alternate explanation, okay, so what? ולטעם זה לעולם אין לאומרו, והלכה כרבה דהו בתרה. Says, why is it not like the Meiri? Because the opposing opinion to Rav Nachman was Rava. And here we need to apply a halachic principle. Halachic principle that says that when you find a dispute in the Amoraim, halacha kebatra. That's not 100% accurate. Batra is referring to the later generations, the really later generations of the Amoraim, beginning with Abaye and Rava. In other words, those who preceded, and then you have a different opinion from the time of Abaye and Rava onward, then you would hold like the latter opinion. The basic assumption there is that they saw the earlier opinions, they knew the earlier opinions, and still rejected them, and therefore, since it went through a certain element of scrutiny, and they came to opposite conclusion, then the halacha is kebatra. That's the halachic principle, says the Chida. Therefore, the Meiri is wrong when he chooses to follow Rav Nachman. Halacha kebatra, halacha should be like Rava. ומה גם, לפי גרסת הריף והראש והר"ן דגריסי מתקיף לרבה, and second point he says, because, and this is the girsa he brings in the name of the Rosh and the Ran, not the girsa that we had in the Gemara, where in our Gemara, or the Gemara as we read it, it said, Rava Amar, the girsa that some of the Rishonim had, which the Chida sees as the more reasonable, Matkifla Rava. Rava questions, attacks the position of Rav Nachman. Deka'amar la bederech atkafta. He's saying it as a challenge. Velo otivu alei. And we don't find that the Gemara resolves that challenge, doesn't reject what Rava says. And therefore, that is indicative of the fact that the Gemara itself accepted Rava's opinion. So the Chida raises two arguments against the Meiri to prefer the opinion of Rava over the opinion of Rav Nachman. Being it's a bit late, I'm going to just touch on pointers here, and anybody who would like to go through some of these things, the sources can read. I did not bring the tshuvot that I brought here, are not full tshuvot. I brought sections of things that were of relevance to discuss. The first claim of the Chida was Hilcheta Kebatra. Is that really so? Here we find two possible answers to the Chida. One is one is found in the first paragraph in the Shut Ktav Sofer. The Ktav Sofer was Avram Shmuel Sofer, the son of the Chatam Sofer, okay? And he replaced his father as a Dayan and so on. He was also the grandson of Rabbi Akiva Eger from his mother's side. Anyway, the Ktav Sofer in the first paragraph writes like this: Umasha Katav Birkei Yosef Dalacha Kerava Dhu Batra. The Birkei Yosef, Chida's claim that halacha should be like Rava because he's Batra. Efshar de Rambam u'Meiri haya lifnehem agirsa Rabba. במקום רבא, וחילופי גרסאות בין רבא לרבא, שכיחי טובה בראשונים. Says, first of all, there could have been that they had the girsa Rabba and not Rava. Rabba is an earlier Amora, and therefore the principle of Hilcheta Kebatra does not apply to him. And argues, the Chatam Sofer, this is not just randomly I'm saying Rabba Rava, but this is a common confusion that takes place. You go to a shiur and somebody says Rabba. And wait, is that Rabba or Rava? Right? It's something that is often discussed. Now, usually it's not relevant, but here it would make a difference because it's a question is, was it a Batra or not a Batra? And so the Ktav Sofer just simply suggests that possibility. But there's also another way to resolve this claim, and that is, I'll just say it outside, I won't look for it inside, is a question of the gears, a question of how the relationship takes place. The Shivat Zion brings that Rava, with an aleph, Rava, who is Batra, but he was a student of Rav Nachman's. And therefore, we have another principle of Rav the Talmid. If there's an argument between a Rav and a Talmid, we give preference to the Rav. And he says more than that. He says, and therefore, it depends how Rava is brought. If Rava is brought that he is speaking to Rav Nachman as his Rebbe, then halacha Rav Nachman because he's the Rebbe. If Rava is stating his statement independently, then halacha Rava because he's Batra. On this point, there is a mega discussion of different versions in the Gemara there. We already saw that the Chidah brings that instead of Rava Amar, Atkif Rava, he attacked. But, first of all, in the Atkif, even if you do take the opinion of Atkif, there are two different versions. Atkif La or Atkif Le. La, Lamed Hey, is a general attack. Le is to him. So if it's Atkif Le, Rava is turning and questioning Rav Nachman, then Rav Nachman is the Rabbi. Halacha ke Rav Nachman. If it's La, he's raising it as a general question, then he's saying it as an independent person, Hilchetake Batra. But more than that, even if we take the girsa that we have, the same distinction might still exist. If you go back on the second page there, we skipped it intentionally. There's a Rashi. Right after the Gemara, there's a Rashi in Megillah. Rashi says something that seems odd. Hachi Garsinan, Amar Rava. The girsa should be Amar Rava. What's the point? What does Rashi want to get across here? The point is that there are two alternates. There can be Amar Rava or Rava Amar. What's the difference? Amar Rava indicates a response. Namely, Rava is responding to his Rebbe, Rav Nachman. Rava Amar is again an independent statement. So the Girsot might determine, if you see that even according to regular halachic principles, if halacha could be like Rav Nachman or like Rava. There may simply have been a difference of Girsot, different versions, what the Meiri had and some of the other Rishonim had. In reference, and I'll end with that, in reference to the Chidah's second question, the Amarle b'derech hatkafa v'lo ativu. So again, if you take the girsa atkifla, then he questions. But then the question is if it's la or le, as we mentioned before. But according to Rashi, once again, and Rashi, not surprisingly because he often holds like the Rambam, Rashi says it's not atkafta, it's not an attack, it's amar. He's making a statement. And since it's Amar Rava, not Rava Amar, he's saying it to Rav Nachman. And therefore, you can't come and say, no, there's an attack here which is not resolved. There's no attack. There is a point that Rava raises to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman still holds by his opinion, and Rav Nachman is the Rav, Hilcheta Kirav, says the Meiri, and therefore, we would have to say Hallel. The question rings out throughout the generations, and another level of question is what was mentioned before, the bracha. That even if you are choshesh and don't want to take the Meiri or completely in his opinion, some of the Achronim say Hallel without a bracha. Comes the Shivat Zion, and basically says, you look in the last paragraph, he says, literally the last line there, is the chumrah, is you're being machmir and say the Hallel, be choshesh for the Meiri, you're actually being mekel. Why? Because there's a halacha not to say Hallel in unnecessary times, and it talks about every day, it's like mevazeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When you say Hallel when it's not an appropriate time, it's actually a bizayon, it's a disgrace to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you gained one thing, you didn't gain another thing. Maybe a resolution that we could suggest is say the Perakim of Hallel, but don't say them after Shmoneh Esrei, but say them after Kaddish Titkabel, and then they're really said only as Pirkei Tehillim. So on the one hand, you're saying Pirkei Hodaya. On the other hand, it does not have a halacha of Hallel, that Soloveitchik in his gimmicks with Yom Ha'atzmaut had suggested. and therefore you could resolve the problem in that way. Open-ended question. I'm not coming to say one way or the other. Should I ever find myself in such a situation, I think I would say Hallel, but let's hope we never find ourselves in that situation. What's that? Nah, because in Miluim, I think that there's enough, the Rabbanut today, the supplies, I don't think that anybody will find themselves. I mean, I was in similar situations, never on Purim, but noch dir.
האם הרב רוצה לשמור את הדפים האלו או שלא?